me start with the title of today's session, Why Democratizing Cybersecurity is Good for Business. I am joined today by Erin Senauer. She's the Managing Advisor, Corporate Services at Tides Foundation, with nearly 20 years of foundation experience in both the nonprofit and for-profit sectors. Erin provides deep expertise in philanthropy and corporate social impact. She has worked with several technology companies and helped them really build large strategic investment programs from the ground up. I also have Chris Painter. Does anyone here that know Chris Painter? So Chris is a globally recognized leader and expert in cybersecurity. And he's been around for 30 years, so I don't really need to introduce more of that. But Chris has been a prosecutor and then held a number of positions at the Department of Justice, FBI, National Security Council, and finally has as the first cyber diplomat at the State Department. Among other things, Chris is also a true believer of the cybersecurity in the public interest. He's been the president of the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise Foundation and is leading the Common Good Cyber effort as an active member of our secretariat. Thank you, Chris. Next is Yochai Ben-Avi. He serves as the non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. Yochai was previously co-founder and CEO of Connect Humanity, Mozilla's head of international public policy, and also policy director at Access Now. In that role, he co-founded RightsCon, which I'm sure everyone here knows really well as well. And then finally, last but not least, Rob Sheldon is Senior Director of Public Policy and Strategy at CrowdStrike, where he leads corporate engagement on a variety of US federal, state, local governments, policies, programs, and initiatives. And in this capacity, he also runs the company's election security initiatives, which serves as company, and also serves as company representative in a number of public-private efforts. And finally, I'm Kaylee Giroux. I'm the Director of Common Good Initiatives at the Global Cyber Alliance, and just the moderator here today, so I'll go on to the next slide. Disclaimer, yay, because you made it to the last day of the RSA, I really don't need to run through the disclaimer, you know it by heart. So I'll move on and start with the business. So we're here today to talk about democratizing cybersecurity. Really, what we want to think about is a different lens in the cyberspace. We want to think about what happened when access to cybersecurity is uneven, and for many reasons it is, which we'll hear about, and how do we protect the broader ecosystem? What is our shared responsibility into that? So without any further ado, I'll ask the first question, but I'm sure everyone wants to hear a little bit about, is what do we mean by democratizing cybersecurity? What really is the meaning of that for each of our panelists here, starting with you, Erin?
Yeah, so again, Erin, Managing Advisor at Tides Foundation. A little bit about Tides Foundation before I get into that point of view. Tides is a philanthropic and nonprofit organization advancing social justice. I sit in that corporate social impact space there, advising on corporate donor advised funds. So many of those companies are tech companies, and I'd say when it comes to democratizing cybersecurity, what's important for a lens at Tides is we really believe that problems and solutions are found in the same place. So when it comes to cybersecurity, yes, we believe in taking down those barriers of entry to cybersecurity, thinking about the workforce. All of you know we're certainly 4 million short as it relates to that, and so we want obviously broad representation in that on all kinds of race, class, all kinds of identities, et cetera. And my colleague over here, Kirsten, she actually heads up our Google cybersecurity clinic. So if you want to know about workforce development and how to make that representative, she's your person to talk about that. So that's certainly important. We also believe that we need to have access for our nonprofits, our civil sector, our government sector, obviously our social sector. They need to have access to all of those protocols and trainings and systems, et cetera. But when it comes to that, piece about problems and solutions are found in the same place, we really believe that those representative folks, that broad spectrum also needs to be at the table for the decision making too. So when I think about democratizing cybersecurity, I think about who's around the table for the solution part of that as well, not just the extraction of what the problem is. So I'm thinking for Tides, it's a lot of who's part of the tech policy decision making, who's part of the governance around that. Obviously, we want representation in the service delivery, how it gets operationalized, how it gets socialized in communities, et cetera. And I guess if there's anything I'd say around that wholeheartedly, it's trust, right? Trust has to flow in both directions when you're talking about problems and finding those solutions. So I think we're at a place also where those that are under cybersecurity attacks are really are delivering really critical services to our world. Oftentimes, Tide sees that edge of humanitarian efforts that are underserved and under-resourced organizations that are under attack. And we believe that, again, those problems and solutions need to flow in both directions to make sure that mission critical work gets done for those communities, et cetera. So I'd say all of our fates are tied, as it relates to democratizing cybersecurity, and that to mitigate risk, we need to make sure that we've have that problems and solutions found in the same place. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, the first being attacked are often the last being served. And Yochai, in your experience at Access Now is well known to being supporting those underserved actors, especially through the helpline. Does that resonate? What do you think about that definition?
Absolutely. I mean, I think when I think about what does democratizing cybersecurity access mean, I think about how do we extend both the breadth and depth of the protected landscape. Who has access to the tools and the techniques and the knowledge and the partnerships? And, I was struck, one of my favorite parts of going to RSA is to walk through the expo hall and see all of the latest sort of products and services that are being developed, and how, really mounting really sophisticated defenses for the ever-evolving threat landscape that we see. But obviously, companies are really the main customer there. Mm-hmm. And too often we see that, especially nonprofits, but also small businesses, right? We see any number of organizations that are doing really important work, whether you care about it from a political perspective and a human rights perspective, or you care about it from an economic perspective. Nonprofits make up 10% of the workforce in the United States. I think everyone would say that hospitals are probably an important piece of critical infrastructure that we want to protect. Well, more than 50% of healthcare delivery on the African continent is done by nonprofits. How many of them do you think are actually benefiting from the latest and greatest tools that we've seen discussed this week? And so I think we really, at the same time, cybersecurity is inherently, I don't think this is too controversial, but it's inherently a team sport. And so I think I hope what we'll discuss on our session this morning is to really think through what are the roles of different players in this ecosystem to expand the protection of that landscape. I think that there is both an incredible need and vulnerability within nonprofit and mission-driven organizations, small businesses, as Aaron was touching on. There's also a ton of expertise. I think that there's we've seen, we were just chatting, the panelists before the session, about some of the really important nonprofit and governmental, quasi-governmental organizations that we really rely on in many ways to ensure any security in any number of vectors that are not getting the resources they need, that are threatening our ability to expand and maintain the defenses of that protected landscape. Aaron also mentioned that Tides holds a fair bit of money and helps to facilitate giving from corporations, from foundations, family offices, a range of different philanthropic endeavors. What is the role of those different sources of capital to contributing to a more secure environment? And so I think that there's a lot of opportunity there. When I saw Access Now runs still the only 24/7 digital security helpline for activists at risk around the world. Part of what makes that effective is partnership with companies and being able to have escalated pathways in order to secure activists at risk who are under threat. Part of it is because we were able to convince philanthropic sources, government sources to provide funding for these kinds of initiatives. But I would say I struggle to think of any organization that had a line item for cybersecurity in their budget and had the resources to really protect themselves. That's why organizations like Access Now need to exist. And then, I think the final thought I'll share is I was, as Haley mentioned, I was previously the head of international public policy at Mozilla. And one of the things that we really thought about quite a bit is sort of what part of security should be on the user, and what can we do as a company to protect our users? What should be up at our level, at the browser manufacturer, so that way the user doesn't even have to know, let alone think about how they can protect themselves. And I think by these kinds of efforts combined, we can really stand a chance at sustaining the onslaught of cybersecurity attack that we see today.
Yeah, really looking at this with the scale in mind and at the infrastructure level. I would certainly not say that the Expo is my favorite experience at GSA. It certainly is an experience, and one of the leading companies on there is CrowdStrike, so why don't I turn out to you, Rob, on that?
Okay, well, thank you very much. Hopefully our booth is somewhat nicer to visit than some of the others, or at least the people there are not hollering at you too hard. But yeah, grateful to be on this panel. From my point of view, it's so important for the vendor community to think about this specific topic set. I have had the pleasure of working at nonprofits before. I serve on a nonprofit board. There are so many really specific and unique threats targeting those sorts of organizations, and often so few resources with which to combat them. So one of the things I'm most proud of with my work at CrowdStrike is the extent to which we as a company have really tried to focus on illuminating threats to different specific sectors and really trying to make those very specific. I can tell you that in my experience, if you try and talk to someone in your community or someone in your life that is involved in nonprofit work, and you just say, there are cybersecurity threats out there, it's not a message that necessarily resonates because there's all sorts of threats out there. But really making that message specific, like maybe to an advocacy group or a political organization, or any type of group that might have a very specific threat to it, for example, by a nation-state actor, to be able to say your specific sector or people in your community are being targeted by this specific threat actor really does a lot to make them say, okay, we need to make some changes potentially in how we operate, or we need to invest some time and energy and think through a security plan, because that can inform their threat model. And it may not just be about making an investment in cybersecurity, it may be about how you think about your executives traveling, or what business processes you use to communicate with people who are in the field, or these sorts of considerations. So making sure that we as a community are publishing information about specific threats so that people can make those sorts of determinations is extremely, extremely important. And again, the specificity, this threat actor in China, the Chinese military, the Chinese Ministry of State Security, or this threat actor in Russia is targeting your specific organization. We've seen it, and maybe for some of these cases, you can't be extremely specific and name other victims unless they're willing to be named or to go public about it. But if you can localize it to a sector, I think that tends to move the needle. Another piece I think about in terms of the democratization discussion is, how do you make tools available and very simple to use for people who are mission-driven nonprofits? So If you're focused on the provision of healthcare or the provision of access or something like that, it may not be the case that you get very animated about cybersecurity. So we in the vendor community, and at CrowdStrike specifically, we think a lot about like how can you make tools exceptionally easy for people to use so that they can focus on their actual core mission. And on that count, I am excited, having been in the field for a number of years, about the extent to which managed security services are much more easy to use from the user's perspective, and then also much more effective often than trying to build, maintain, and sustain a full security program, which really is very challenging if you're not an organization that's in the thousands of people, right? Mm-hmm. We see cybersecurity threats that are lightning quick, only a slight exaggeration, but really minutes from when you see, or less than a minute in some instances, from when you see a threat actor gain an initial foothold in an organization. Maybe they've breached an endpoint or an identity, to be able to either move laterally or escalate privileges somewhere to be able to be off to the races for a breach. And if you don't have a 24/7/365 security program in your 10 or 20 or 100 person nonprofit, which most people don't, it really does make sense to think about how you can have a managed security service watch out for your security and help you do that during weekends, during holidays, and things like that. And then finally, I've been excited in the past couple of years to see the extent to which we're thinking about concepts like secure by design, so that, like you've mentioned, from the end user standpoint, and often the end user is just kind of a consumer, or at least in small nonprofits, they're using kind of consumer technologies. Everybody relies on browsers, on cell phones, and things like that. A lot of times for nonprofit organizations where people are volunteering and things, they're not actually in a traditional enterprise network, right? So there needs to be a lot of energy and vigor from some of the people who are making consumer services to be able to secure those and make that very straightforward for all their users, because it doesn't just help us as individuals in our individual capacity and friends and family and stuff like that, but it actually does help the infrastructure that's underpinning a lot of the work that we've all talked about here today. So those are some of the core considerations that I think make sense to stay focused on.
That makes a lot of sense, and I think we already have a bit of a piece of the puzzles on the shared responsibility with industry building tools that are usable and secured for all, and foundations thinking about how to secure their ecosystem, the grantees and the communities and the non-profits stepping up and filling in those gaps. But we haven't heard from our government's perspectives, and so I'll turn to Chris.
So, it's great to be here, but I'm going to build on all the comments I heard, but there's this adage, which annoys me all the time, which is, there's many adages that annoy me, but one of them is that cybersecurity is everyone's responsibility, and you hear this especially around, October, National Cybersecurity Awareness Month. Well, that may be true, but the fact is not everyone has the capability to have that responsibility, and not everyone's actually taking responsibility, even if they have the capability. And so this plays out, I think, in a number of ways. One is, there's a whole constellation of folks who are doing critical things, and you mentioned this as well. Folks like the Shadow Server Foundation, folks like the group I used to lead, the GFC, which does capacity building. Folks like, there's a group called Sightline Security that I work with, which helps provide security for nonprofits, for instance. It's one of the group of companies that are nonprofits that do that. I'm on the board of the Center for Net Security, that their mission is to serve the underserved as part of what they do, and to provide that thought leadership and how we go forward. So there's lots of things out there, but they are critically unfunded. They are critically not, what happens is, not the people represented here, but a lot of times they're thought, oh, this stuff's just gonna happen. Even big companies are like, well, this stuff, it's in the background, it's gonna happen. But if it didn't happen, it'd be critical to the health of the internet writ large and cyberspace writ large, but it's just not valued in the way that it needs to be. And to be sure, there are groups who've come in and helped to fund these things, although it's a very, very small pool that will do this. It doesn't come close to meeting the demand, and that's a real challenge. And this is exactly, Kelly mentioned this in the beginning, why this group, Common Good Cyber, or this idea of Common Good Cyber, was founded a couple of years ago with the idea of trying to get these groups together, trying to get more awareness and understanding of what these folks do in the ecosystem, and then critically get them actually funded, get them supported. And so that is a key effort. It's ongoing. We're making more and more effort. We're trying to I think we're getting some momentum on that, but it is, I think, an uphill battle, especially now when you have, you mentioned governments and others who fund some of these things, including some of the funding that used to come out, well, has come out of the State Department to help people in around the world who are dissidents and others to be able to express themselves. That Access Now is very involved in. A lot of that funding is going away, or at least going away for now. And that's critical. When your funding is low already and it gets even lower, that's a real challenge. So that's one aspect of it. Another aspect, I think, is, and you mentioned this too, where do you move the responsibility in the chain for this? So you can't really expect the end user, frankly, to do, even if you have the right tools, you can't really expect them to protect themselves against nation-state threats, to protect themselves even against criminal threats or ransomware threats or others that are out there. So that means, I think, and we've said this for years, but it just hasn't happened, you have to kind of move cybersecurity up the stack. And that might be in the ISP level, that might be in another level, that might be in the company level as providing services. The hard thing about that, obviously, is all these people are in it for profit, understandably. And you don't make a profit by providing that service because there's not a demand signal, because people still don't understand the importance of cybersecurity even today, even though we've been talking about it for 30 years. And we have great conferences here. So, if that demand signal is not there, but it's critical to the health of the overall system, then we have to figure out how to change that too. And I think that's going to be a challenge going forward. It's always controversial where you put the responsibility. In the last White House, there was the National Cybersecurity Strategy, which said for the first time shifting the burden. I'm guessing that's not going to persist in this one, we'll see. So, uneven around the world too, but I think that's critically what we need to think about, because, we all know people depend on these things. It's only going to get more true. And it's certainly true for a vast group of underserved folks who just can't afford the solutions. So you get to see down the hall or downstairs in the other building. But it's critical to do it because everyone has to rely and does rely on this for things that sometimes you don't even know you need.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I think we are gaining momentum, but I've been here all week and I know other nonprofits have as well. I see CyberPeace Institute here, Shadow Server, Cyber Threat Alliance, and there's one thing that really always strikes us is the business says what's in it for us. I mean, I think you've gave quite a compelling story about why we should democratize cybersecurity, but still that return on investment is always a little bit of a challenge for us. So why not turn to you, Yochai, with that question?
Sure.
What's in it for the business? Why should they care about cybersecurity for others? I know you worked on a number of fiscally sponsored projects, for example. Was that effective? Or?
Yeah, I am old enough to remember when DDoS was like a fairly rare occurrence, perpetrated by predominantly state and state-affiliated actors. And, obviously these days we've seen that particular threat really filter down to pretty low sophistication, run-of-the-mill, cyber criminal organizations. And that's a pattern that we see often, right? Where we see some of the most sophisticated attacks start by some of the most sophisticated adversaries, not surprisingly, state and state-affiliated actors, generally perpetrated against nonprofits and press organizations, human rights defenders. And in that sort of tip of the spear, and I think we saw this a lot when I was at Access Now and really dealing with this on the helpline, we saw these attacks coming in every day, right? This is now a sort of commoditized commercial service. Plenty of people make plenty of money selling DDoS mitigation and protection these days. And I think that there's a real underutilized opportunity for cybersecurity companies to partner with nonprofits to work on some of the, if you help protect those frontline nonprofits, you're going to get, a 12, 18, 24-month head start in knowing what the latest, most sophisticated attacks are going to be, while also helping to support nonprofits to continue the important work that they're doing, providing vital services. You'll probably get some good press out of it, and depending on how you configure things, you might even get a tax deduction. But I really think at the core is to sort of say, if I told you that you could get a 12 to 24-month head start on knowing what the next wave of sophisticated threat vectors and attack signatures and techniques, how much would that be worth to you, right? If that helped you to understand as that type of attack filters down into criminal organizations and becomes, in its own way, democratized, and therefore there's a business case for that, how much money would you pay? How much support would you be willing to provide to those nonprofits to get that head start and that vantage point into the evolving threat landscape? And so I think there's a real opportunity there in terms of sort of finding that nexus of the sort of ROI for democratizing cybersecurity.
And it's super interesting, like that those underserved actors, like nonprofits, are being used essentially like a playground by the attackers, and as like first, like we said at the beginning, first attacked and last reserved. So I mean, that question seems to be pretty much addressed to you, Rob, in terms of what is that a good return on investment?
Yeah, it's such an important point. It's such an important point. So I have the privilege in my role of being able to talk with a lot of people in governments globally, and this is one of the first points that I mentioned to them actually, is that there are certain vendors out there that aim to specifically defend military networks or things like that. I start every meeting by saying, we as CrowdStrike, as a global vendor, we're protecting nonprofit organizations, we're protecting critical infrastructure organizations, we're protecting service providers and things like that. And if your technology solution is architected in such a way that all of your customers benefit from the threat activity that we can identify and block on any customer, then that creates a sort of virtuous cycle. Everybody gets to become more secure. And it's a feature of intelligence organizations like the People's Liberation Army, like organizations in North Korea, Iran, Russia, and others, that they are animated about targeting the U.S. Army, the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Air Force, and so on, also their global counterparts. And that one day, and then the next day, they're targeting some, Tibetan resources group or advocacy group or something like that, or some other dissident organization that's more configured like a nonprofit. And as a vendor, you want to be protecting everybody for that purpose. I mentioned before that there's a really important role here for consumer services and consumer applications to be attentive to that. Frankly, I think that there's some that are doing a good job. That are trying to, if you make a browser, if you make a smartphone or something to that effect, I think you have some telemetry, some visibility in this sort of thing. I think people could be more open about the threats that they block, so that that piece I mentioned earlier about communicating the nature of the threat and the specificity of who's being targeted, because that helps to raise awareness. But it's definitely all part of the same system. We as a cybersecurity vendor, we protect nonprofits specifically, and we have a pro bono program where we can work with certain organizations, but I don't think we should be under the illusion that scales for everybody. You mentioned a huge portion of the workforce is in nonprofits, so we really have to think clearly about how do we bring some of those insights and some of those concepts into the sort of normal course of how people produce and consume applications and technology services. I think we're better at that, frankly, than as a community-wide, we're better at that than we were, say, 10 years ago or 5 years ago. I think we wouldn't be having this talk if it was a solved problem.
Thank you. That was a perfect answer to your high questions. Erin, you had past success, I'm sure, perhaps as well in other sectors, and some of the challenges that we're facing in cybersecurity and democratizing cybersecurity are not specific to cyber, something that happened to other global sectors. So, what was successful that we could replicate?
Well, I almost step back, because I spent a lot of my career advising corporations, advising businesses, kind of making sure they understand that our fates are tied, that obviously a secure world is a secure world for our governments, for our public sector, so all of that public sector work. So I often make sure that companies, businesses sort of understand that our fates are tied, and that also there's this piece too around that in many ways businesses solve, and sometimes they don't like when I say this, simple problems, solvable problems, But many of us that are working in more of that public government, civil sector, we're solving very entrenched, hard problems, and we have for a long time. Many of us aren't going to see success in that in our careers, in our lifetimes, et cetera. So I think we know that, our fates are tied. So a thriving business means a thriving democracy, a thriving world, right? A secure world. So it's often give general operating support grants, back to like get off your assets, quite frankly, give of resources, time, talent to these organizations that are, nonprofits are the second highest cyber attacked. So there's almost like an immediacy that I advise around that. And nonprofit, an organization like Tides that is a funder, I do like to say give general operating support grants too, so that you can pivot on what's immediate threat, what's an emergency, what's a crisis for a nonprofit, a civil organization, et cetera. I think we learned in COVID that that's the best way, because we live in a very volatile, increasingly volatile world. So I think that piece is very important, that funding piece, but also socializing that, again, our fates are tied. So if you want a thriving business, we need, certainly a thriving democracy.
Thank you. Well, Chris, I'm sorry, I always keep you last.
Again, just building on some of the things that were said, I think, one of the real challenges, and this, is the hardest kind of funding to get is that operation, that core funding, because people love to fund projects. They don't love to fund them enough, but they don't fund that thing that will allow people to be more flexible. I agree with you. And I think one of the things we need to do better, everyone needs to do better, but I think this community needs to do better too, is the storytelling part, is explaining why this is important, why this impacts me, why it impacts businesses, we read about major cyber incidents all the time, and we read them and go, oh, that's terrible, and the next day we don't care anymore. And so that's been true for years. Now ransomware has changed that a little bit, but I think quantifying not just the dollar harm, but also the longer term societal harm, the impact, the human impact, helps tell those stories in a more compelling way that gets more people to say, okay, I need to do something about this. This is valuable to me as a business. And there are two kinds of businesses, obviously, or there are many more, but there's cybersecurity businesses, there's one group, but then there's all the other businesses who are also impacted by this. So I think weaving that story together and being much more compelling about the way we talk about it and using examples that people understand is something that will help spring some of this loose.
Thank you. As part of this panel, we were thinking about what people could do once they go home with this information. We've been very active in thinking about our role into that, but for some of the people in the audience, that might be a little new. So for the last question, and I'll go around again, I'd like to think a little bit about those actions. And we had drafted a few of them, but you're welcome to go off pace of that, but I'll just run through what we were thinking we wanted the audience to take away with in terms of how you can apply the learnings of today, which is, as a business, within a week, try to think about these non-profit-led efforts or open source efforts, really, that you're dependent on, really as a business risk management strategy, and reach out. If you're using the MITRE ATT&CK framework, reach out to MITRE and ask if they need funding for that. And I know they do, so that's already the answer for it. If you use the shadow server threat intel's data, just reach out to them as well. They're here, by the way, so go away. If you want to understand, if you have a bit of added capacity and want to volunteer, reach out to the Cyberpeace Institute and provide your expertise to the Cyberpeace builders. And just do that a little bit more proactively. That will help out the entire ecosystem. And then within 3 months, just think broader about your corporate social responsibility. What can you do for more security by design practices, like Rob explains? What can you do for the broader community that you have, like Tides approach, for example? And then within 6 months, we had to put it there. Really just incorporate that in your business practices. And at the Common Good Cyber, we're hoping to launch a fund which will provide that baseline funding to all of these initiatives. So consider funding that as well. But I'll turn to each of any one of you in order. So starting with you, Rob, see if you want to add anything to that.
Yep, thank you so much. I just want to thank everybody who showed up here. Like, everybody here probably either works at a nonprofit or has friends and family that work at nonprofits and are sort of animated about this topic to come at this time in the morning on the last day of the conference. So one thing I'd think about as you're going out and just talking about cybersecurity or cybersecurity threats with some of these groups is to really give consideration to what I mentioned earlier about managed services. I think for a long time, the field's been stuck in a place where the sort of atomic unit of cybersecurity support is the SOC analyst or the cybersecurity analyst or something to that effect. Look at there's plenty of reporting out there. It's not just CrowdStrike that talks about the threats that we observe. It's everybody in the expo hall. Is it possible for a group that, if the nonprofit that you work with or advise is 50 or 100 people or less, is it viable to meet some of those threats independently, or is it worth engaging with a managed security services provider to really help shore things up? And then also, everybody, I think, really ought to be thinking about secure by design. I thought it was notable and frankly very nice that at Secretary Noem's keynote speech on Tuesday, she mentioned that DHS would continue secure by design work, which is not always the case when you have a change of administration or change of leadership in an organization like the Department of Homeland Security and CISA, obviously. And that's just in the United States, but obviously the initial secure by design products really engaged a lot of CISA's counterparts internationally. So even if you're here from abroad, that's something that I think other of CISA's counterparts should be thinking about, and then vendors all over the world should really be thinking about. And that's true if you are a service provider, especially because there's a lot of threats to end user organizations through supply chain attacks and things like that. And then also, obviously, because of the nature of different partnerships, especially in the nonprofit world, a threat to one can become a threat to many, right? People can move laterally in different ways and target multiple organizations in a cluster. So I just want to encourage everybody to take what steps they can to make sure that the organizations that they work with or support can keep doing the good missions that they're setting out to do. And hopefully, over some time horizon, as we get better at this as a field, have to worry less about the threats and more about the service provision or the sort of core theme or mission of the nonprofit. Thanks.
So let me build on that. One of the things that I was most proud of at Mozilla when I joined in 2015, about 27% of all connections in Firefox were encrypted at that point. And the company had and still has the sort of bold, audacious goal that we want to encrypt the entirety of the web and have 100% of connections encrypted that are served through Firefox. And there's a lot of work to sort of sit down and sort of what can we do in product? How can we help solve this problem? And it was through a lot of partnership by Mozilla engineers and engineering leadership, but also with other companies and with nonprofits that led to Let's Encrypt. When I left Mozilla in 2020, I think we were at something like 87% of connections were encrypted that were served by Firefox. And I'm sure that's only gone up. And so it is that kind of partnership, I think, also speaks to the strength and expertise that exists within the nonprofit sector to help you sort of think through some of those security by designs, to think through how you as a company can expand the breadth and depth of the protection that is offered and the ways that your products can be a part of that holistic solution. And when we were at Access Now, as I said at the top, right, part of the way that we can help provide that 24/7, 365 support to some of the most at-risk actors around the world is because we have relationships with companies where we can get access to those security teams. That's awesome. Please do that and work with those kinds of global intermediaries. And Chris also named a number of great folks who are doing important work around this. But then I think there's also, if we look closer to the ground, and that sort of partnership with those frontline organizations, with those generally pretty low sophistication, low knowledge folks. Part of that is offering pro bono services or discounted services. When I was at ran a project that was sponsored at Tides. You know, we were able to benefit from Tides' partnership with TechSoup to get access to a number of different tools. And I think that is important in terms of securing the ecosystem, but as I noted earlier, I think it's also a really valuable source of threat intelligence to help you understand what are the threats that are coming down the pipes. And so I think we can get way more creative, especially as business, in terms of how we democratize cybersecurity access.
So again, I mean, I think that you know, one thing you should check out is the Common Good Cyber initiative, and so which is I think commongoodcyber.org. Is that right?
Yes.
So yes,
You're
check it
doing
out.
great, Chris.
You can see a lot of good activity. You know, and I think this is not just a thing for big companies or big organizations too. So, you know, and I understand that especially when you're a startup and it's you're in the innovation stage, so you don't have a lot of time to do anything else. But I think start even thinking then how you could be part of this larger ecosystem, because I do think there are rewards from doing that were mentioned already, and that it's not just, you know, and there's lots of underserved populations too. It's not just the dissidents and people around the world, which is obviously important, but there's a lot of other folks too. And so, you know, I'll be brief. I just say, look at that, see how you can engage. I think this is a good initiative, but I also, there is, you know, to go back to my first statement, you know, cybersecurity is everyone's responsibility. Actually, this is everyone's responsibility, like making sure this ecosystem is secure, and we are democratizing it. It's not just a few people who either have the capability or are willing to use that capability for everyone.
And I'd just quickly say, because, you know, there's many technicians here, so it's that piece around, if you have resources to put towards cybersecurity, do that. I think many of us are tied to the missions of many nonprofits, so discuss with that nonprofit you're close to the importance of cybersecurity, because if they go down in a cyber attack, so does that mission. And I think having that conversation is super important. Give that general operating support that can go towards cybersecurity efforts. And then I'd say, you know, Tides, not only TechSoup and a lot of Okta, you know, all these great organizations and resources we give to that fiscal sponsorship, that nonprofit grantee side of the house, but we also encourage folks to join nonprofit boards. If you have that skill and expertise, that is one of the best things that you can do. We've been working with board.dev, which has a goal of getting, you know, 30,000 you know, technicians and tech folks on boards by 2030. You know, this is just great efforts because they're looking for that leadership, because they're serving missions, like critical, hard work missions, and aren't always thinking about their cybersecurity, et cetera. So that would be my additive there. So.
Thank you, Tomat. We've been prompt to move to question and answers, and we do want to hear if anyone here has additional questions to the speakers. So if you do, please step up. There's 2 microphones in the front, so just go. Oh, perfect, go ahead.
Hi, yeah, my question, which I think is good advice, but it's about the MSP. How do you ensure the integrity of the MSP? You know, there's so many that kind of hang a security shingle in front of what they do, and they're really not competent. But I think the fact that it does aggregate seems like it's powerful. But how do you find that balance, or how do you keep a not-for-profit making the wrong choice?
Thanks so much for that question. I think that there's a tendency with these sorts of things for people to orient toward, like, is there someone in my community who serves in this function, or, you know, is there a person I can talk to and, you know, sort of shake their hand, and or that works for 5 other people that I see as my counterparts as nonprofits, and those are reasonable sort of points of entry into investigating who might be a good partner for you. But really, I think that for people who are cost conscious, and all nonprofits are, it's frankly just very important to think about a vendor that operates with scale, because they can offer often very competitive prices, and they can be held to a certain level of a service level agreement, which is, you know, of the type of responsiveness that you need if you have a really severe threat environment, right? It's like not necessarily the best thing to just optimize for someone that is you know, makes a representation that they like are going to, you know, serve you, and they're going to focus on you and dedicate time to you, if it's not an operation that has like the sufficient scale to be able to protect you 24/7 by 365, like no kidding, during holidays and all that type of thing. So just being like open to consulting with vendors that do operate with some level of scale. And there really there's resources out there that kind of compare and contrast these things with each other, things like Gartner and Forrester, and they tend to do a reasonable job at assessing the, frankly, fairly crowded landscape of different MSSPs.
Thank you. Any other questions? Don't see anyone stepping up.
I have.
Oh.
Go.
Oh, go on, Chris, if you have additional. And there is another question.
My question is for Yochai. So you mentioned a hotline earlier. Is that something you had a hand in establishing? And is a goal of that hotline to provide help for nonprofits in the event of a cyber attack with technical advice and resources to bring their systems back online? And what does the first step or the first contact look like? Is it to understand their predicament, knowing that it could be time sensitive?
Yeah, so I was involved in helping stand up the Digital Security Helpline. It works with a wide range of nonprofits, media organizations, frontline human rights organizations, the sort of a gamut, some political actors. If you go to help@accessnow.org is how most people first contact. They have also if you are a more sophisticated actor, their PGP keys are available on their website. They're also reachable. I think there's now, you can reach them on Signal as well. And it really depends. There are some folks who are coming, my website went down, what do I do? There are some folks who, are sort of someone says who's on their board or who supports that organization because they care, and so say, hey, you're like under threat, you should get some support. If you haven't been attacked yet, one, you probably have, but two, you probably need some support here. So it's a range. Some of it is like super reactive, people in crisis. How do you, help stem the flow? Part of it is preventative work. People are reaching out and sort of say, all right, and to the gentleman who asked about MSPs, one of the things that Access Now does is like, let's do a threat assessment, really figure out your threat matrix before we start talking about any solutions. Because we need to really understand the nature and likelihood of the threat matrix for that organization or that individual before we can really get into a conversation about what's the right constellation of support in order to to the best of our ability, secure that organization.
Thanks for your response.
There's an org called Tech to the Rescue, too, that I think can be good in a crisis.
Absolutely, and I should, that's a good point. Access Now runs, I believe it's still the only 24/7 helpline, but they are also sort of therefore a first point of entry for a lot of folks, and there's a very broad referral network of partner organizations who have specialized expertise where they can sort of help to refer out to people who are doing great work or in specific languages or in specific regions or with familiarity with specific threat actors. And I think it's those kinds of collaborative approaches that are also super important.
Yeah.
Can I mention briefly? An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Like, so whether that means working with an MSSP, if you can afford to do that, or at a minimum getting a threat assessment or having a relationship in advance before you have an issue, whatever it is that you can manage with your workload and your resources and things like that, you should definitely do that, because by the time you have a significant breach and you have a breach, like then what you're looking at from a time and a complexity and a cost perspective is so outsized relative to what an initial sort of investment in time or energy or resources might be. So if you're thinking about using one of these resources, and you haven't yet, I would say do it now.
And then just, it's not a response to that question, but as we're talking about democratizing this too, it's also breaking down barriers between communities. And I should mention this, is 2 weeks from now in Geneva, there's going to be something called the Global Conference on Cyber Capacity Building. And the point of that is to bring the traditional development community, which doesn't really know cyber very well, and the cyber community doesn't really know development very well together to try to free up more resources for this. So that's one community bridging effort, but there are a lot of others out there.
Thank you. I think on that note, we're at time. So thank you everyone for staying with us, for waking up early. I hope that was interesting, and we'll see you around.